Is there a part of people that secretly would like their partner to be able to completely read their mind so they never have to talk about sex?
Oh, how much easier would that be? We expect to be experts in this part of our lives without the usual routes to becoming an expert, which are, if we become an expert in anything, we realise that there's a process to that. But when it comes to sex, we're just expected to all know what we're doing, and we're never meant to go outside of that box. We're meant to just keep it all contained, nice and neat and tidy. But sex isn't nice and neat and tidy.
Welcome to the Authentic Man podcast. I am your host, David Chambers. This is a podcast for men who want more and less from life. More deep connection, more emotional intelligence, more self-awareness, and more great sex. And less heartache, less conflict, less overthinking, and less stress. Creating dating lives, sex lives, and relationships that are incredible and authentic. My deepest goal is that you, the listener, can take away what you hear in this podcast and apply it to your life so that you can experience greater happiness, transformational growth, deeper relationships, and profound sexual intimacy. I believe that as men, we are capable of so much more depth than we are shown or led to believe. So join me as we get deep into this. Welcome back to another episode of Authentic Man podcast. I'm your host, David Chambers. I'm a men's dating, relationship, and intimacy coach. I work with men, really helping them transform their relationships, take their relationships to a new level, and take their ability to connect and getting to beautiful connections with women they meet to a new level, as well as breaking patterns and habits that are getting in the way and uncovering those habits and patterns as well. I'm losing all my words today. So today, episode about sex. I know you guys love sex. Whenever I do episodes with wonderful experts, as I do have two today, you are all over those episodes. You listening to them, you downloading them, you absolutely devour them. So today is no different. I have Kate Moyle, who is a psychosexual and relationship therapist. Right? She is, certified Psycho-Sexologist, and she's a host of a wonderful podcast, which will be in the show notes. And she's author of a book called The Science of Sex, which I'm actually thinking about adding to my, my list of things I need to read. And she's been on some of the biggest podcasts in the world, including The Diary of the CEO as well. So she is an absolute expert in what she does. And in this episode, I kind of just questioned her a lot, actually. I'm lucky enough to have met Kate in person. We sat on a panel and did a panel talk together, which was absolutely fabulous. But today we talk a lot about the troubles we have with sex, the mental, the emotional, the physical, the communication troubles we have, like what gets in the way of us having good sex. We spend a good amount of time talking about that, talking about communication and porn and fear. And this kind of ever undercurrent question that we have about our sex is like, am I normal? Am my desires normal? As the things that are going wrong, are they normal? And often we don't believe that they are. We usually tell ourselves they're not. But we explore that in many different ways, talking about the effects of mental health and stress on sex, whether that's anxiety and ED and PE and so forth. And then we dive into also talking about the negative way in which advertisers are taking advantage of people's sex lives as well. And then we get into how can we have great sex? What can we do to have great sex? How can we have better sex with our partners? And we dive into that and spend a decent amount of time talking about that. And we talk about one particular thing that I think will be quite important to you is we talk about how can we talk to our partners, if we're a female partner in a heterosexual relationship who may be suffering from PE or ED. That's PE is premature ejaculation or erectile dysfunction. How can we have a conversation about that? How can we connect in a way that is loving, kind, compassionate, and create a good outcome for all of us? And then we finish up with my own personal question, which is about how can we have great sex lives when we've just have kids? Because as you probably know by now, I have a little baby boy that's on the way very soon. And when you're listening to this, it's actually possible that he's born, but let's pretend that, do everything live. So it's a wonderful episode full of really good information, the sort of episode that you should share. You should share this with somebody, yeah? A friend, a partner, even a relative, right? Someone who you think this could be useful to, or someone who you'd like to have a conversation about what is contained in this episode. So I really implore you to share this episode. And I'll stop there. I'm going to let you jump in because I've been talking a lot. So I'll let you jump into the episode and enjoy some more. Hello, listeners. And I'm back talking about a subject that I know you love dearly, because I see that from the numbers of people that come and listen, especially in the early week of the podcast coming out. Talk about sex. And I know we all love talking about sex. No, actually, we don't really like talking about sex. We try and avoid talking about sex, but we're all very interested in sex. And it's that one thing that we probably don't talk about enough, unless you're in my world where I talk about it incessantly with various people in my life. And today's guest is someone I come across on Instagram a long time ago, actually. I've been following for a long time on Instagram. I had the lucky and beautiful privilege of sitting on a panel with her where we talked about sex, love and intimacy. And it was an absolute rip-roaring event. And it was wonderful to meet her. She's a bundle of energy, a bundle of love and compassion as well. Hi, Kate. How are you doing today?
Hi, good. Thank you. You should write my PR after that introduction. I'll take it. Always nice to be described as a therapist as compassionate. But yeah, it was a joy doing that panel, and I'm so excited. We've done kind of a few things more recently together, and kind of especially the most recent kind of men's sexual wellbeing event. And these are conversations I think are super, super important for everybody. Yeah. And it's, in particular, I see men not talking about sex, or where I think it was something we talked about on the panel, was when there is a panel conversation about sex, it's a panel of women and they're talking about men from a perspective of maybe their own personal experiences, or maybe their experiences vicariously through their clients, without actually having a man who has experience of being a man talking about what it's like to be a man and being sexual as a man. Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we see is that men talking about sex and sex for pleasure particularly, and the more vulnerable side of sexual experiences and sexual functioning, we see that those conversations are really still not happening in the same way that women are having them. And this is, not even considering kind of people who are trans or non-binary or gender expansive, but, a lot of these conversations are very gendered, but particularly these narratives about who can talk about sex or how we can talk about sex tend to be quite gendered. And, the event that we were talking about, which was on with the sex toy brand Lelo, all about men's sexual well-being and pleasure, we saw that it was actually quite a big deal for us to be putting on an event exclusively about male pleasure, to get panelists like yourself involved, and to get men to kind of attend events like that as easily as we would find it for a female audience. So there's something very, very interesting in that as well, and a lot of the research that was done around that. And I'm sure, we'll get onto that kind of further into the conversation, but it becomes very apparent when you are trying to set up these things that problem still really exists in society.
Yeah. And I find it interesting. One of the things I spoke to a journalist a while back, I think it's a Cosmopolitan, and in between the questions she asked me, she was like, why do you think there's such a lack of kind of advice, and we're talking about dating, for men? And I was like, because if you look at the column inches of newspapers and magazines, I was like, most of it about sex is really geared towards women. It's not really geared towards men. And it's not written by men. It's written by women describing men, often through a lens of their own wounding or their own troubles that they've experienced with them. I was like, this is one of the reasons I see why men are so scared to come forward and talk about sex, is because they're so afraid of being attacked for their views or their opinions. And I'd love to know your thoughts on that as well.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's all very much steeped in a very patriarchal history where sex was all about men. And interestingly, even the model of how we prioritize sex, and we talk about orgasms and pleasure. Originally, basically, that was based on male sexuality and then just applied to women. And we see that the orgasm gap, this pleasure gap, still exists even today in 2024. And there's quite a lot in that. And I think that a lot of the conversations and a lot of the media and a lot of the kind of pleasure products and the sex toys and everything that goes with that, a lot of that was about bringing that all up to a more equal balance, bringing it up to close that gap, to say we should all be experiencing pleasure. We should all be enjoying this in the same way. We should all be experiencing sex as this completely fulfilling thing. And, you know, the first sexual revolution that we saw was the 60s when the pill came out. You know, even just that initially the pill was only allowed for married women is quite a big statement in itself. But that created a huge change, which was now we can all have sex in a way which is more freeing, more decision focused, more about informed choices, more empowered, more about how we choose to have sex and the risks that might potentially be involved. And we've seen this huge increase in sexuality products, sexual wellness, sex toys, pleasure products around female sexuality. And that has kind of normalized it. We also have women's magazines, where I think a huge thing, particularly of kind of 90s, early 2000s, still are. But there aren't so many options for men. And a big part of those and that culture was about sex. But the flip side of that is, although perhaps men might struggle with these sexual conversations more nowadays and might see that or perceive that, for example, kind of female sexuality is more ahead or more normalized and the conversations are happening more, we still see a big gender health gap when it comes to men's health and women's health. So whenever we have these discussions, I think it's really important that we look at the historical context, the kind of current context, everything that's going on, but also these two sides of the same coin. And I work therapeutically with a lot of both men and women and couples and lots of kind of same-sex couples. And there's so much about all of these narratives, and particularly very gendered narratives, that affect everyone. And it's, you know, we see them playing out in the therapy room all the time.
Yeah. It's all very, it's not as simple as we sometimes would like it to be, you know, like all men are like this and men are like, you know, and we see this a lot. We spend our time on Instagram and we spend our time. It's very easy to make these very clear cut things about how it is sexually for men, for women, for people, when it's actually a much more of a complex kind of mismatch of things. And you said something about the models of sexuality. And I've always thought that the idea of the orgasm gap, as valuable it is to measure, it always occurred to me as a very, shall I say, masculine way of grading people's sexual, like, enjoyment or experience, because it's all about the end. It's all about not necessarily the end, but this goal that we have. And it's not pleasure-based in so much as like, oh, am I enjoying this moment? Is this next moment good? Oh, did I enjoy this next moment with this slightly different texture of feeling and experience? And in my work with men, I have a men's program that I run, a group program, and one of the modules is about sex and intimacy. And I actually tell them to self-pleasure, and I ask them to do that regularly throughout the week, but remove orgasm as a goal. And there's always a look of shock and horror on my face on their faces when I say that to them. But I guess I've always seen that this, like, only looking about this goal really misses the point of actual general pleasure and enjoyment, and actually can create and does sometimes create a lot of pressure on both men and women from the men and women and the couples that I spoke to about orgasm.
Completely agree. And the goal-orientated nature of sex, and so often people kind of getting hooked up on that or fixated on that, can really take away from sexual experiences. But the reason that the research around that gap exists is because in lots of sexual conversations and definitions and assumptions, men orgasming in male-female sexual experiences, in kind of heterosexual sexual experiences, was always a given. And I think that the perfect example of that is if we surveyed 100 men and 100 women, today, if you and I went out on the streets and asked people, and we asked the question, how many times have you faked an orgasm, or have you faked an orgasm more than once in your life, or have you ever faked an orgasm? We would see that the statistics would speak for themselves in terms of who is reporting doing that more commonly. And when we think about the linear model of sex that so many of us assume or think about sex, it typically goes along the lines of, well, first, the kind of outline is, the assumption is that it's what we call PIV, so penis and vagina penetration, so intercourse. And most people would say something along the lines of, oh, well, we might be making out, there might be some mutual masturbation, maybe some oral sex, and we'd have intercourse, and it finishes when he orgasms. And the female orgasm hopefully is fitting into that somewhere, but it isn't necessarily even kind of defined as part of the process in the same way that male orgasm is. And I think that's where this research comes from. Dr. Laurie Mintz is one of the most famous researchers in this space. And it was the fact that most people, men and women, in lots of sexual scenarios, would assume that without a male orgasm, that this experience had some way been a, inverted commas, failure. But in a lot of those experiences, the female partner might not orgasm, and that wouldn't be considered in the same terms.
Yeah. 100%. I see that as the even from, just my experience of talking to men, this linear, it's like we treat it like our career, I start my job, then I get my first job, I get a promotion, and we treat in that way that actually is super limiting. And it's interesting.
We think about the baseball analogy: first base, second base, third base, home run.
Yeah, even better. yeah, and it's not that. That makes for very mechanical sex and very boring sex. And I imagine that in your work as a therapist. Is this a common complaint in couples, in women, in men, that the sex becomes predictable in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is what often drives us sexually, or what kind of feeds into our desire, is novelty, is anticipation, is excitement, and all of the things that often come naturally to us at the start of relationships. This is one of the biggest things that couples struggle with, is the feeling that we used to have it. We were those people once. We had sex like that once. We want to get back there. And back there is also a phrase that I'll come back to. But like anything in life, we habituate. As humans, we get used to it. We find a way, the way works, we carry on doing it. When it comes to sex, that's layered with the most common challenge for people, which is we don't know how to talk about this, so we also don't know how to change it if it's not working for us. Or this is the way we've always done it. I don't want to risk upsetting the status quo, so I don't want to do it a different way. They seem to be fine, so I guess I should probably be fine with it too. And I don't want to ask. We have this real fear about asking questions of our sexual partners, of checking in, of exploring. And the routineness around sex is a really common complaint, because what it also leads to is a responsive lack of interest, perhaps, or a responsive lack of interest or lack of desire. We're not so interested or motivated to do the things that we know exactly how they're going to go, because we know how they're going to go and we prefer to do something new, or we prefer to do something else. And so that's when people can get stuck. And a side of that effect of that can then also be a pulling away from sex in terms of removing the things that might potentially lead to sex. So often when couples are struggling with sex, what we also see is that they don't lean into the potential bridges to a sexual experience. So the kissing, the cuddling, the reaching out to each other, the sitting next to each other on the sofa, the reaching out to each other in bed, the flirting, those things tend to then get cut out as a management strategy for avoiding sex. Not necessarily a conscious one, but we go through the thought processes of, I don't want to start something and then not finish it. I don't want to let my partner down. I don't want to lead them on. These are the phrases that we hear a lot of the time. And it's because the the kind of satisfaction that we might have been getting from a sexual experience has changed or might not be what it used to be, or we might need to adapt it. But most of us don't know how to do that.
And that's where talking comes in.
That is where talking comes in. The answer that nobody wants, how can I change my sex life for the better? We have to learn to communicate about it. And everyone, well, I say everyone, most people, you can just see them kind of sinking and just thinking, no, that's the one thing I don't want to do. That's the hardest thing. That's the thing I really didn't want you to say. But we know that it is the linchpin to sexual experiences. And most of life really, but particularly when it comes to sex, because we can't be mind readers. We can't know what's going on for our partners if we don't ask them.
And is there a part of people that secretly would like their partner to be able to completely read their mind so they never have to talk about sex?
Oh, how much easier would that be? Wouldn't we all quite like that in a way? I think sometimes, to not have to think about it, to not have to make ourselves feel awkward or embarrassed or put ourselves out there or fear the judgment of our partners or fear the rejection. It'd be much easier. But we are not a society of telepathic people. We cannot understand what's going on in our partners' heads. But there's something that I often say around sex, which is that we expect and are expected to be experts in this part of our lives, but without the usual routes to that, to becoming an expert, which are learning, exploration, trial and error, questions, answers, research, asking other people, peer reviews, all these things that if we become an expert in anything, we realize and we recognize that there's a process to that. But when it comes to sex, we're just expected to all know what we're doing without any kind of consolidation of information, communication, questions, errors, and we're never meant to then go outside of that box. We're meant to just keep it all contained, nice and neat and tidy. But sex isn't nice and neat and tidy, and it doesn't fit that. If sex is a skill to be learnt, then we are failing miserably at giving people the education and the tools that they need to learn it.
And that education, as I got so many questions in what you said there. The education, I guess, is the education that we all don't receive in our early years of life. And I say early years, I mean, the first kind of 20 years of our lives. I know that I look back at my sex education and I never forget that day at school. I'll never forget that day at high school where I came into a class and there was a woman in there as well as my teacher. There was some cucumbers. And we were like, why is there loads of cucumbers in the classroom? One cucumber was put on each table of like 5 or 6 people. Then we were told, here's some condoms. Try and put the condoms on the cucumbers. Then we were kind of proceeded to be told about like how not to get pregnant. And I think about 15 minutes later, she was gone and we moved on to a new topic. And it maybe not consciously, but I think unconsciously it was like shame ridden. Like, oh my God, we have to teach these children about this sex thing. We don't really want to. This is going to be awkward. And that was my formal sex education. Is that one of the kind of contributing factors of why we kind of have this, as you described it, the box, the inadequate sex box that we all wander around with?
Yeah, I think in general, we are seeing improvements, but it's not good enough. And we're kind of seeing this push towards things being more inclusive and including conversations about consent. I mean, consent was never discussed in the sex education that I had. And we're seeing that there is a big shift to changing these conversations, and that what we call a kind of more sex positive or pleasure focused approach to sex, which is the reason that we know that most people are having consensual sex is for pleasure, for fun. But that this kind of fear-based approach or shame-based approach, which many people had, hasn't set people up to explore sex in a informed, kind of safe, questioning way. And it is problematic, but there are now amazing sexual health charities, places like Brooke, who are doing phenomenal work trying to change the conversation and resource people. But one of the other things is I think that so many of us had our sex education And then we left feeling like it wasn't good enough, or we had all these thoughts, these fears, a lot of the time, a lot of fears and anxieties, and we didn't know what to do with them. And then we've kind of gone into starting to be sexual and to have sex lives and never addressed some of the original stuff that we've been left with. But also, many of us have been left with the feeling of, okay, well, I didn't get the sex education that I wanted, so now I'm doomed forever and I can't have it. And that's one of the things that I do as a big part of my job is, as an adult, you can get the sex education that you want. You can change that at any time. You can get access to the information that you want at any time. And, this is what my book is all about, is equip yourself with the knowledge at any point so that you feel you can improve your sexual wellness at any point. And you don't have to stick to that very rigid kind of shame-based understanding or model. You get to redesign it. And once we know that sex is about consent and providing it's legal and consensual, that those are the pillars of it then being an explorative process or experience. And that can change with every partner, with the same partner, if we have sex with them hundreds of times, that there are numerous ways that we can be adapting it and it be this more fluid, plastic part of our lives.
Because the world we live in now, there is so much availability to information, like if you're a younger listener and you're listening to this, I'm just going to set a little scene for you about when I was like 18, 19 years old. Pornography was in magazines and you used to go into the corner shop and try and buy some. And that was in itself a whole like kind of mission, because you need to go someone who would actually, and you might see the corner shop man might be the same man who sells your mum, I don't know, her Woman's Weekly or something like that. And that was just pornography. And when it came to sex education, we didn't really have the internet. It wasn't quite at its, you could barely stream a picture, let alone a video. So finding any sort of sex information was difficult in and of itself. Now compare this now to 2024, where there are literally hundreds of thousands of workshops, books, courses, retreats, therapists that you can speak to about sex, and you can literally pick up your phone and type in the words, how to have better sex. And you could find hundreds of articles about that. And just imagine now, maybe you are listening to this and you're in your early 20s and you're thinking, my God, David, you grew up in these archaic times where, did you even have wills? Yes, we did have wills. But it's much easier now for us to access like all of this wonderful, rich, high quality information and knowledge about having better sex, having more loving sex, having more connected sex.
Yes. And the top shelf was always where those mags were, and often people would get given them in a brown paper bag. And they then, I remember everyone kind of standing outside the paper shop being like, you go. Like it being like whoever lost the bet would have to go in. And it's very different. And, I think we can't have this conversation without saying that clearly, the flip side of the accessibility, availability, very few barriers to accessing that information is that a lot of young people are accessing the information without the educative element. So a lot of people are using what they find online as a de facto education. And that is problematic because, again, then if that becomes your definition, your working model, so to speak, and that hasn't come from a place of education or consent or, communication that doesn't have any information around sexual health or how to protect yourself, and you go into your sex life using that as your working model, then there's no correction to that, because the educative bit is the correction bit. So for me, when we're having these conversations and, people kind of very regularly just say, we should ban for example, all pornography. And that's not the answer, because the problem is what we're seeing is that there's this gap between the education, because when we equip people with the knowledge that these things are different, and that real life sex is very different to the sex that we see, which is created to arouse, or the experiences we were created, which have a different function or a different purpose, then we're able to tell the difference between the two. And it's when those two things get confused that we see that there's a big problem. And, there's a whole separate episode and kind of conversation to be had here about the fact that obviously not every website or anything is created equally. There are obviously huge problems with any field, but I think there's such a big thing about access to information and education here.
Yeah, and it is a huge piece because I grew up in a Christian household, and my mum was, devout Christian, still goes to church every week, and there was never a conversation about sex. And I knew of friends of mine whose, is this true? Or is it their parents asked them to not be included in the sex education? I think that was something they were able to do. And I think there were schools I knew of that didn't do sex education. I might not be quite right. I knew people went to schools like that. And that leaves that gap, as you said, it's porn. Basically, it's like most of us, many of us, our sex education really is porn. And we know how problematic that is because, listeners, a shock horror for you. Porn is entertainment. It's like a movie. It's created for fun, for a certain level of fun, not to be real. And I say this in jest, but I don't know if we kind of really consciously or unconsciously realize that. I spend a lot of time talking to men, and when I talk to them about their porn use and their opinions around sex, there seems to be some correlation, not necessarily between the level of porn use, but like some of the misconceptions that the men I often speak to have about sex that directly relates to porn and how we see porn. Things like, especially that affects men around size, how long sex should be, the type of speed of sex and so forth. And porn has a lot to answer for because it has really impacted how we think we should be having sex. So I guess my question there is how much do you see in your work the effect of what people think consciously and unconsciously and from their societal influences and porn and so forth, think about the sex they should be having?
Well, should is a banned word in my therapy room for exactly this reason. And I'm sure anyone who's ever listened to an interview with me before will be like, oh, we've heard you say that so many times. But it's a banned word because people often say to me, oh, well, I should be doing this. I should be that. We should. And I say, who said should? And often the answer is society, ? Not really sure. No one said should. There is no should. There are norms and narratives and social expectations. These things are very social, a lot of these beliefs. But these shoulds are not kind of written in stone idea. But something you were just saying there about kind of recognizing the difference between these things. Someone once said, and I have no idea who it is, and so I'm afraid I can't credit them, but they said that watching porn to learn about sex is like watching The Fast and the Furious and learning to drive. And I think it's the perfect analogy because we can see there are some similarities. They both involve like some of the same things, but the function, the style, the goals, the aims, the purpose, everything else about it is different. And I think that a lot of those narratives do and ideas do get consciously and unconsciously set up. I would say over the years that I've been practicing, the thing that I've noticed is that men particularly, I think, and women, but, when I'm working with men around this conversation and for the purpose of the podcast that you and I are having, that there is a much more awareness of the impact on their thinking and their feelings about sex and their sexual experiences and their sexual functioning and their sexual selves now than there used to be. And I think that's because this conversation has been happening more and more and more. So we're seeing a much kind of higher level of awareness of, I don't think this has been good for me, or I don't think this has helped me, or I think that this is shaped some of my ideas in a way that I want to do something about or I want to address. And it's not just about pornography. We're talking about the movies. We're talking about Netflix series. We're talking about sex on screen. We're talking about social media, reality TV. I mean, it's all around us. And a lot of it is very allowed in that way. Advertising, for example. And social media is an interesting one for me because we're so often kind of metaphorically looking through the window into other people's lives, seeing how much better we think that they are than ours. You know, the whole thing is it's about more. It's about what have they got that I can't have? How do I get that? And a lot of our assumptions when we're seeing those people with, you know, whether it's great bodies or what look like great relationships on, you know, with great lives and everything, that we assume that sex is a part of that. We don't probably consciously think it, but we're like, oh, they probably have great sex too. It all looks so good. How could they not? And I think there's something in that which is a quite interesting thing for us to dismantle as well, because in general, we overestimate the amount of sex that we think other people are having. And therefore, we consider ourselves comparably to be less or to be having a problem or to be struggling more.
Frequency is a big thing for a lot of people sexually. There's like, how, you know, I'm not having enough sex. Oh, I should be having more sex. Other people are having more sex. You know, oh, that couple I see on Instagram, they look like they're having loads of sex. There's, you know, you're kind of speaking into that thinking that we have a lot.
Definitely. And how, you know, it's we shouldn't be objectively measuring such a subjective experience. You know, why are we not focusing on quality of experiences, satisfaction? It's because it's the only quantifiable way we have to measure sex, aside from, you know, the pleasure gap measuring kind of how often people are reporting orgasming, reporting their partners orgasming. But there's just something so limiting. What does it mean? I mean, you know, what does it mean if one person has had one partner their entire life and they've had sex thousands of times and someone else has had 60 different sexual partners that they've had sex with once? How is that quantifiable? Does it mean that one is better, one is worse, one is more enjoyable or not? Like, there's nothing that can be said by numbers, but we have this real obsession with experience, and particularly people really feel it when they feel less sexually experienced. I see a lot of people with anxiety around starting new relationships or dating or starting to kind of venture back into the dating world if they've only had one or a few sexual partners. The anxiety of I'm less experienced or I feel inexperienced can really, really come up for people. And it's just such a subjective term. There's no clear guidelines for what would be considered experienced or not.
And this is something I commonly hear with men. You know, they're like, I'm not very sexually experienced. I'm feeling, as you said, I'm feeling scared to date because I'm not sexually experienced. I haven't had as many sexual partners as other people have had. And they're not wanting to, and it creates a huge amount of anxiety and stress and fear around sex. This is, I think, is, you know, sexual performance anxiety. I guess it's sexual performance anxiety. It's a huge thing, I think, for men. I talk about them a lot, actually, as a topic. So I wonder, from your point of view and your experience, how does the kind of stress and this kind of mental health side of things start to contribute to the sex we're having? I don't want to say the word sexual dysfunction, because I have an issue with the word dysfunction when we're talking about sex, because often dysfunction, we're usually pointing the finger at men, and it's usually erectile dysfunction or premature ejaculation. And my experience as a man is that those things happen to us. Almost all men I know have experienced those two things occur to them once or multiple times in their life. So I don't want to call it sexual dysfunction, but I can't think of a better word. You probably have a much better word than I do. But how does stress and these mental health issues like anxiety affect our kind of sex lives and even our relationships?
So we can use terms, aside from dysfunction, things like unreliable erections or difficulties with, challenges with, because for some people they also might not fit a clinical definition of what having erectile dysfunction, for example, would mean. But it doesn't mean that because they've been experiencing this for 3 weeks that it's not distressing to them, or that it's not causing them even more anxiety. For me, as a clinician, I often experience people having a cycle of stress, anxiety, and difficulties, or, dysfunctions, if you will avoid that word, but for the purpose of kind of explaining the point, difficulties, challenges, and these two things feed into each other. So particularly when it comes to mental health, we see what we call a bidirectional relationship between sex and mental health, meaning that our mental health can impact our sex lives and our sex lives can impact our mental health. And that can be anything from feeling highly stressed in a situation outside of sex. So for example, at work, we get home, we're struggling to switch off. Our phone is going nuts. We're kind of taking our to-do list to bed with us. Our partner initiates sex and we're completely in a different headspace. And without kind of really realizing, we're trying to kind of get into the mood with them, but we're struggling. We feel really distracted and we start to struggle with our sexual arousal process. So an example of that could be struggling to get an erection. And then what that causes is a potential stress in us and in our partner, potentially in our relationship. It's particularly layer on top of that, we don't know how to communicate about these things when they're going well, let alone when they're not going as expected. And we might have a kind of dissatisfactory or challenging end to that experience. The next time we go to have a sexual experience with our partner, we have that in the back of our head. We're holding that as a thought of, okay, but last time that happened, I don't want that to happen again. Better keep an eye on things. We're hypervigilant. Again, not really kind of fully sexually in the moment, but distracted by the thought of the potential that it might happen again. And again, that can be enough to kind of start us struggling as we start to give the fear a little bit more attention than we do the experience that we're actually enjoying. And the way that arousal works is the pleasure that we're feeling, are focusing on that. So the combination of being in the moment, the physical touch, and the kind of psychological setup are the things that are going to help us to experience that more and boost arousal. And our thoughts are one of the biggest distractions that we can experience. And, distraction in general is an absolute killer for our sex lives. So that's an example of how, I suppose, stress can leak from outside of our sex lives into there. And obviously, if we're struggling with sex, what we can then start to feel is anxiety, stress about what it means for us to be someone who struggles with sex. So we talk about metacognition, that we think about our thoughts as humans. What does that mean about me? What does that mean about my identity? What does that mean about my masculinity? Is something I often hear from men. Me as a partner, and then the conversations between partners might become a bit more difficult if they're not able to discuss it. And that can create more stress, potential anxiety, contributions to lower mental health, an impact on self-esteem, which can then cycle back round and further contribute to the sexual problem.
It's a vicious little cycle, that.
And so quick to start. I can't tell you how it's much easier to start than it is to break. And I believe that's because of this lack of normalized conversation, kind of more sex negative kind of culture and messaging, the shame that we all feel about the fact that we're struggling, and the fact that we feel so isolated in our experience. No one else is talking about this, so I must be the only one. I must be the problem. We have a kind of potential for being more self-critical than self-affirming anyway as humans, and it feeds into all of that.
And then I think, as you say that, I think what we were talking about before around, the expanding realm of women's sexuality and the not so expanding realm of men's sexuality. So if women are having a problem in their sex lives, I'm assuming, this is a big generalization, listeners, that they are more likely then to go talk to a friend and go, oh man, this is going on in our relationship. I don't know, how is this something that's going on for you? Because in general, women are better at communicating. They're more likely to have closer friends than men do. They're more likely to feel comfortable with talking about topics of sex with the people in their lives. Whereas a man's having these issues, And he's seeing this kind of vicious cycle occurring, feeling like he's not normal, feeling like there's something wrong with him, and not necessarily seeking any help or conversation or anywhere he can, as I often like to say, like release a little bit of that pressure through a little valve that can let off some of the steam.
I'm going to disagree with you.
Wow, good.
Because I think when it comes to sexual challenges, difficulties, we don't really see many people starting the conversations, and we see a huge delay in uptake for people going to see physicians. For example, for women and people with vulvas, sexual pain is very common. Because it is very common does not mean that it is normal. But we see a huge delay in uptakes for appointments for people who have concerns about their genitals or any pain, any difficulties with sex. They will typically leave it until they kind of get to a crisis point or a breaking point before seeking a professional opinion. And we see conditions like vaginismus for people with vulvas, so which is an involuntary tightening of the muscles, which means that no penetration can be achieved, or if it is, that it's very painful. That can be from everything from tampon use to fingers. It's not just about intercourse, to self-pleasure. But there's I would say there's a general difficulty, irrespective of gender, about the conversations when sex is going wrong or when it's going badly or when it's going not as expected. It might be what I think the difference is, and this is not a research-based point, but more of an anecdotal from working with lots of people, is that for people with penises, you can see if you're struggling with an erection, and it feels more visually obvious or more apparent to everyone involved in that situation. And I think that can be both a point of anxiety, and when things are going as expected, a turn on or kind of a contribution to arousal and desire. We cannot see when someone is lubricating or when there is increased blood flow to the vulva and the vagina, or that they are engorged. We can't see that. So I think there's something also going on which is quite basic, which is about the visual of when we're having these sexual experiences.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Yes. Because that visualness I guess it's why men can gain so much confidence from their erection, because it's like, it's there. I can see it. It's happening. I can feel it. It's like, I'm doing a good job. I'm being a good man. Like all those kind of traditional masculine narratives we're experiencing just looking at our penis, whereas when it's not doing what we would like it to do in that moment, there's that sense of, I use a word as one of my clients said to me, like failure. It says, I feel like I'm failing.
Yeah, and think about all the Hollywood versions that we see of those scenes, or the Netflix versions we see of those scenes. They're all very similar, and they're all quite pretty judgmental. I mean, because obviously everyone's hamming everything up for TV, but those are the scenes that we have that are most representative of sex not going to plan, not working, because they're the ones that are accessible, and they're the versions that we see. They're not representative at all of how sex is. They're very limited, actually. And I think intimacy coordinators have played a really good role here in starting to shift that a bit, to making these scenes perhaps more realistic sometimes, or more representative, more inclusive, and more true to actual sex. But they're kind of painting the image of lots of people's worst nightmare, and we can then run through a scene in our head and we'll think, oh, this is happening to me, that's happening to me, I'm the guy in that film. And that comes loaded then with a whole kind of storyline, and we feel like we know where it's going before we've got there.
And it's never positive, right? There's never a positive. I've never seen a film or a TV show where, for example, a man struggles to get an erection. I've never seen a TV show like this where it's like, it's okay, it's cool, we can find other ways to love each other. And he's like, oh yeah, that's true. And then they cut to the another clip, and they're both having amazing sexual experience without an erection, and then they choose to finish whenever it feels appropriate for them to finish, and they're lying back going, "Wow, that was amazing." We never see that. What we see is just disappointment, right? And then when we add in, I've noticed a lot of advertising around the various tablets that are sold to men, Viagra, Cialis, and so forth. This real emotional play of like, without the tablet I'm selling you, disappointment and sadness, relationship breakdown, pain. With the tablet, joy, happiness. Everybody's fulfilled. I really observed that as well as the kind of the narrative that we see in movies and shows.
Well, there's a big shift because those drugs, that group of drugs, they're called PDE5 inhibitors, were made accessible over the counter. So instead of having to go to your doctor to get a prescription, you could fill in a form or buy them over the counter at a pharmacy. And that was, I think, a couple of years ago. And then now there are services who are delivering medications on subscriptions and things. Now, I'm not going to say that there is not a place for those medications when appropriate, because for some people, for medical reasons, for example, for some people they might be needed, or for people who have been through some kind of injury or who are struggling in a variety of ways or need something there as a safety net to help them. But I think jumping into using medications without any exploration of what it is that might be going on can create a sense of them being reliant on those medications. Now, what the flip side of that is that can provide a safety net perhaps for a temporary period of time, which can give you the confidence to then get over the hurdles that were getting in the way and to get you back to having the sex that you want to have, and then you can kind of stop using them. But for some people, they might fear that not using them means that they will go straight back to their words, as you said earlier, are like failing at sex or sex not working or sex not going to plan. And so these have to be informed decisions that we're making like we would about anything else, but the access to them has changed. And it's something that we've seen, a lot of reports of, for example, younger men using these medications, in their 20s without much process behind that. A colleague of mine, Dr. Ben Davis, who is a men's sexual health specialist and trainee psychosexual therapist, did an Instagram post recently about the move from taking medications to something like psychosexual therapy. So a bit more kind of biopsychosocial, or kind of helping you to understand what it is that might be going on. And I think it's a real fear for people that they found something that worked and they don't want to let go of it. And we can completely understand that. Why would any of us want to let go of something that we feel is working?
Yeah. And I think it's Cam Fraser. He does these lovely depictions of things that are very clever. And he was showing how the advertising for these, PDE5 inhibitors, how they've changed over time. Like through the 90s, it was like, some old senator in the United States they were selling to. And then now we have a few of them, which I keep seeing on my Instagram feed. And the men that they're showing in these pictures are men, the couples of women, they don't look past in their mid-20s. And I find it really fascinating that I wonder, I'm interested in the Advertising Standards. Is it Advertising Standards Commission? I can't remember exactly what it is. But it's there's this real play on men's insecurities around their performance. And it seems to be, there's a few other companies. There's one company I used to do some blood testing and they the same. And it's it feels really immoral the way that they're really pushing on this deep insecurity. Plus that insecurity is something we don't talk about. So it's almost like they've got a really not safe market, but they're tapping into an insecurity that we have that no one talks about. So they've almost gone, this is the only solution for you. And I can keep feeding someone this solution that I'm selling because I partly know they're never going to find another solution because of the shame that they may feel, not necessarily guaranteed, to go elsewhere and like see someone like yourself or get the sort of help that would, instead of just being a band-aid of a problem, would start to go to the root cause of the problem?
I'm the first person as a psychosexual therapist to say approaching a psychosexual therapist and saying I need to work on this and talk about this is probably the harder option. Definitely the scarier option, for sure. And, you know, if we don't acknowledge that, then we're not doing our jobs correctly. And I never underestimate how hard it is for someone to come for a first session, how hard it is for someone to send an inquiry email, because it's such a big part of saying, okay, I'm going to take the harder route here, which is that I have to explore this stuff and ask the questions and kind of dig around in the areas of my life I don't think I really want to, and address the things that I've been trying for a while to avoid addressing, or hoping that this phrase I hear all the time, I thought it would work itself out. And how much easier is it for us to access something quickly, you know, easily with someone we might never see again, you know, over a counter. And there's absolutely something in that. And, you know, it's not the only place we see this. We see that, you know, for example, feminine hygiene industry is playing on insecurities, that the vagina is pH balanced. It doesn't need to smell like roses. It's a body, a human body, but constantly these products are being advertised about, you know, making you smell like something that you're not meant to smell of. And we know that actually some of these things could cause more disruption to the way that the body naturally is. But it's an anxiety which has been brought up, which has been created, and the problem is being created and the solution is being offered. And there's definitely something in that. But I love Cam Fraser. He's been on my podcast, and I think some of the ways that he explores some of these big themes are great. And for me as a therapist, you know, in the therapy room, a lot of the time I'm helping people to kind of think about these themes and to break them down. And we think, you know, who's profiting from this? What's going on here? You know, do you think that belief is in your best interest? Is that belief helping you? And often when we kind of break those down and we do lots of exercises around kind of myths and truths and facts, and, you know, it's something we do a lot on podcasts, I think, is, okay, what is it in these setups? What is it in these beliefs that I feel are helping me get the sex life that I want, or are stopping me from getting the sex life that I want? Because so much of that is social.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've explored, you know, a lot of the issues and the stigmas and the troubles that we have. And I'd love to circle back to what I think he said was one of the most important things, the communication. How can we communicate with our partners about sex? I know it's a huge question. We could talk about this for like the next five days, but we don't have 5 days. But the listeners listening in who are, you know, maybe thinking, oh man, the sex life isn't where I like it to be, or I'm struggling with this. It's like, how can we approach our partners and go, let's have a conversation about this, please?
One of the things I would say is, don't approach your partner about talking about this if it's a new thing for you to do as you're about to have sex, or after you've just had sex, or kind of in bed, you know, in the usual place that you'd have sex. But you can always suggest it to them outside of sex if it's something that you've been thinking about for a while, and don't just spring it on them, but like gently bring it up, gently suggest it. Say, I listened to a podcast today and it was about talking about sex, or it was about sex. Can I share it with you? Maybe we could both listen to it and then we could talk about it. Or I talk about them as L-shaped conversations. So where you introduce it through a different means, which is via something like a podcast, a TED Talk, a book recommendation, an article, something like that. But don't just kind of sit them down and be like, right, we need to talk about sex. Because if you've been preparing the conversation, you've got an idea about what you want to say, but it's news to them, they're going to be completely caught off guard, probably feel a bit defensive. You know, the general story is, if we have to talk about sex, it's because there's a problem. We don't do it as a part of maintaining our sex lives, our sexual well-being, or improving. We have this undercurrent, which is people only need to talk about sex when it's a problem, or talking about sex is a bad thing, when something needs fixing, inverted commas. And try and also use positive language. You know, I talk about the benefits, the pros of your relationship, your connection, what you miss, thinking about times that you had sex that you really enjoyed. Wouldn't it be great if we were able to, have an experience like that again? And there are now, as you said, so many great podcasts, games, card sets, books. Xander and Vanessa Marin, who are a couple, she's a sex therapist in America. They were on my podcast last season. They've just written a great book about sexual communication. There are card sets from places like the School of Life and the Self Space, which are hundreds of questions that you can ask each other. So if you don't know where to get started, there's something else that can kind of prompt you to know where to start. And I think that just getting started, knowing it might be a bit awkward, knowing it might feel a bit new, that it might feel a bit embarrassing, but that you can admit that to each other and addressing the changes that you want to make in a positive way. So not, this isn't good enough, you're not good enough, I'm disappointed, I want more, that kind of critical lens is only going to be met with defense or attack. And so kind of going in at a neutral level and with positive and affirmative language, this is something I'd love us to try together. How would you feel about us doing that? Shall we choose something, you and me? All of those things I think are really basic. And I think a really simple way of doing it is, if you're kind of thinking about the conversation in your head, think about how you would feel if your partner approached you with that comment, and see if it feels okay for you or not. And if it doesn't, then it's probably not the right place to start.
As you say, what I'm hearing there is like approaching it as a team. Like this is something that we want to be better, not finger pointing, blame, pushing responsibility onto them, actually being like, oh, this is it's both, positive and together.
Yeah, mutual buy-in, but also we all need to adapt our sex lives all the time. I think about my own sex life. It's very different in my 20s to, now as a parent, as someone in a long-term relationship. It will be when I'm 60. We don't expect everything else in our life to be the same all the time. Why would we expect this to be the same all the time? And it's the perfect example of, again, where we feel a bit stuck with our definitions of sex, which is this really, fixed concept, and it should never change. It should be adapting all the time, and we should be able to adapt it all the time. And we see this with people who are going through infertility or are postnatal or have cancer or have injuries. They're forced to adapt, even if it's just for a period of time, because of life and the context and the circumstances. And actually the adaptations, how can we make this better? How can we make this work better for us? How can we make this feel better? How can we enjoy this more? We used to love that, but it doesn't feel like it's working in the same way. Shall we try something different? This should be a part of the conversation all the time. And we should be building that as an idea into our sex lives and to our sexual well-being.
Yeah. Don't start having conversations about sex when you quote unquote see an issue or problem. Start at the beginning, having conversations about sex continuously. So one question I get quite often that kind of creeps into my inbox on the old gram is a female partner messages me and says, my partner is struggling with ED or PE, and they don't want to do anything about it. And I can't talk to them about it. They're really defensive, and if I mention it, it becomes an argument. What do I do? How can I talk to him in a way that, we create this we? And I'm posing this question to you.
Is that so? I see. You're making me do the hard work for you.
Definitely.
Yeah. I think the first thing I'd say in these scenarios, and I work with lots of couples going through these kind of challenges, is not making it a big deal. The bigger deal it becomes, the bigger challenge it becomes to face. And we should understand that bodies sometimes do things we want them to do and sometimes don't work in the ways we want them to do. And we accept it with everything else. in our physical functioning and in the way that our bodies work. And sometimes we can run 10K and sometimes we can hardly make it to 5. It's a perfect example of how the same body some days can do something and some days just can't. And obviously we know that our psychology plays a big part in that. But I think the first thing is not making it a big deal and not kind of pulling apart from each other, but kind of trying to maintain a level of closeness and intimacy and contact, because our most natural reaction when something like that happens is to pull away completely, like kind of hands off, don't touch me, like avoid, kind of pretend it didn't happen, shut down. And the amount of times I work with people where they say, like, okay, and then what happened? And they say, I just rolled over and like put my back to my partner because I just felt really mortified, or I felt really ashamed, I felt really embarrassed, and I just wanted to go to sleep and forget about it. But what you're doing then is you're breaking contact. And also what's happening is that is building that relationship between anxiety, stress, feeling those high intense feelings, and that the solution, as far as your brain is concerned, remember we're thinking about kind of the way that we learn, kind of neurochemically as well, is to pull away and break all contact. And then we start to relax again and kind of come back down to our resting state. So maintaining contact, even if it's just holding hands or having a hug or having a kiss, kind of reassuring each other, means that it's also going to be something easier as a bridge to kind of cross back into sex again. I would say then take the focus off sex or whatever isn't working currently for you completely. So building up what we call sexual currency, which is anything that you do with a partner that contributes to your sex life that isn't sex, and maintaining kind of sexual play or physical contact, kissing, touching, all the things that might lead to sex, but don't push them to have to lead to what is currently the struggle, because we're trying to make it safe again. Mm-hmm. And communicating about it, focusing on other parts of sex temporarily. So whether it's focusing on your partner or using sex toys or whatever it is, trying something different, because also trying the same thing again and again and again, if it's not working, is only going to kind of, dig in to that becoming a repeated experience, and your expectation being that if we do that it's not going to go as planned.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. Because there's this, and I've spoken to many men about this, is the moment that one of these challenges occurs, I always feel that moment is a really special, the moment after that moment is incredibly important to how we respond and how we react. Because as you said, we can create a pathway of negativity around what happened, or we can create a pathway of connection, as you called it, I've wrote it down, it's like keeping connection together, whether that's like responding with love is what I say in that moment. Like, we're having sex and something doesn't go the way we want it to. As much as we may feel, I personalized, for example, if we're in a heterosexual relationship and I'm a woman, my partner, his erection goes, and suddenly as a woman, I personalize that and make that mean like, this happened because he doesn't find me attractive, or there's something wrong with the sex. There's a natural inclination to want to pull away and be like, oh my God, I've done something wrong. Let me roll to the other side of the bed. But in fact, and what I'm hearing you say is that makes things worse, because it creates an association of, for the man, of erection goes, I lose love and connection. And that's a problem. I've done something wrong. And that kind of beds in something negative. Whereas what I'm also hearing you say is if we can respond differently in those moments, respond with connection, or respond with curiosity, respond with, this is okay, we can do something else. This is something else we can do. We stop that connection from ever being created.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we do internalize often. We assume, okay, I've done something wrong here. Often in these kind of scenarios, both partners are feeling the same and they're just not able to communicate about that. But I often say to people, if that happened to your partner, if the shoe was on the other foot, how would you react? And most people say, I'll tell them it was okay. And, we'll do something again later in the week, or, we can go to sleep. We can just have a hug. And the empathy we show for other people and particularly the people we love, is not often what we do for ourselves. And I think that it's a perfect example of, in those situations, how sometimes we just need to think, okay, there is something much bigger going on here, which is that we need to manage this in a way which doesn't break things down. And often, if it feels like it's quite unexplained, so we don't know exactly what it is that we're struggling, or it is because we're highly stressed, or perhaps because we're on a medication, or because, like the example I gave earlier, we're really stressed at work, that confusion can become such a problem, or the lack of explanation, and then not being able to explain to our partner. And then our partner starts saying to us, explain to me what's going on, explain to me what's going on. And we're saying, I can't explain. I feel really stressed about this, or this is making me, how can I explain to the partner I've been having sex with for 5 years that I suddenly feel a sense of anxiety around sex when we've had sex hundreds of times and it doesn't look on the surface like anything changed? It's a very hard thing to explain.
Yeah.
And we see, that, as we said, the movie version, oh, they're just not that into you. That's the first place that most people's thoughts go.
That movie, eh? He's just not hating you. I've got 2 more questions I want to ask before we wrap up. One of them is something that I see a lot with couples, and I see the man coming with. And the second thing is just really a personal thing I want to know, for my own good and well-being. Because, as a podcast, I can be really, really fucking selfish if I want. So the first one is that, as I'm sure that occurs in your practice a lot, is couples that have been together for a while, long-term, man, what's long-term? Anything from a year to, 50 years, I think we can class a long-term relationship. And the sex department starts to shift and change, and they may describe that as diminishing desire or diminishing amount of sex over a period of time, and they become unhappy or sad or longing for different times. What can couples do to keep, and I'm going to use a word I don't like to use, I'm going to put it in inverted commas, quote unquote, the spark, because I have my own personal feelings about that word and that meaning. What can couples do to keep the aliveness, their sexual aliveness and connection going over a long period of time, over a long term of the relationship?
One of the things that we see most couples who report, or couples in long-term relationships reporting sexual satisfaction, is that they make their sex life, their physical connections, their sexual well-being a priority. They intentionally work on it. So whether that is putting time aside to be together, making sure that it's a part of their relationship, that it's prioritizing it. For some people, scheduling time to be together. It can be about kind of consciously trying to break up routines, doing new things together outside of sex. So seeing our partners in a new way is a great boost for our desire, and us not assuming that we know everything about them. Often people will say that they're really attracted to their partners when they see them through the eyes of someone else. So for example, a best man speech at a wedding, or playing with their nieces and nephews, or seeing them at a work event when everyone's telling them what a great job they did, whatever it is. So I think trying to see your partner in a new light, doing something new together, but making it a priority, or making it an important part of your lives, because we know that it slips down the priority list. We see it happening. We know that life has got increasingly challengingly busy, and that this toxic productivity kind of culture is not leaving much space for the personal side of things. And also that lots of people are both working parents, and there are so many challenges to finding time. But something I often say to couples is, we can't wait until we can find time. We have to make time.
It's and actively participating in creating the sex we want now and the sex we want in the future. That's what I'm kind of hearing you say there.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And the last question I have, this is completely personal, just due to how my life as my life changes and I move into this new phase of fatherhood, I'm going to have a little child. And, how do I keep my sex life alive when I have a little baby that, wants feeding and wants stuff and only has one way of communicating for at least a number of months, which is crying and screaming?
I think one thing is recognizing that it will change, at least temporarily, and that your needs might change, your partner's needs might change, that, when we have a newborn, we're fairly depleted, we're really sleep deprived, that having a new baby takes a lot of attention, and that is important for that baby's survival. It needs the attention, and you're moving into a new phase of your relationship as well. I work with lots of couples who are kind of becoming or have just become parents, and you're seeing your partner in a new light, and there are so many things going on around that. And I think finding the little moments for those, as we said, sexual currency. So showing affection and physical affection without it needing to lead to sex, if that's kind of what's going on for you, just making the space for it. But I think allowing yourselves a chance to recalibrate, get used to this new period of your life. And then when you're ready, it's an ironic kind of term, but taking baby steps back to sexual intimacy. Because often, particularly, depending on also how a birth has gone, there are kind of physical impacts and physical side effects. And, your partner might feel like their body has changed, and there's so much that kind of goes on around that. And there's a lot to unpack. And a big shout out to a colleague of mine, Dr. Karen Gurney. He's just written a book called How Not to Let Kids Ruin Your Sex Life. And so maybe get a copy of that.
It's in my Amazon list at the moment. It's in my Amazon list because I was like, I am not too, sometimes you can think, but I'm sure I'll be able to handle this and know this. And then I thought, I know much better than to have that sort of thinking, always taking information in from people who know better than me. It's one of my real kind of mantras for life,
Well, I think, you just keep talking and keep building. I think one of the things that often happens when couples have a new baby is they feel quite abandoned by each other because suddenly all the attention that they had for each other becomes shared. And it's because you move from 2 to 3, if you're only having one baby. Obviously, sometimes people have more than one baby, but you're moving into a new stage, and it can feel like anything new, strange, or that we don't know what to expect, or we don't know how we're going to feel. And it can feel a bit kind of, like we've been abandoned, like we used to be our partner's priority and they used to be ours, and now we're not, and we're feeling a bit unseen. And I think that knowing that there are so many phases and stages to this, and working out sometimes just how to get through them with just enough to keep you guys going, but whilst giving each other what you need and being able to ask for it. And sometimes we can get that in other ways that isn't sex when sex isn't possible.
Yeah. And you say about the not being seen or sharing attention. It's something that a lot of the men who I know have had kids in the past have said to me is like, that's something they just didn't realize was going to occur. They just felt really like left out. They're like, I feel like I'm just this third person watching these two people, my baby and my partner, my wife, having, this really deep experience. And I'm just on the outside observing it. And quite a lot of them described to me loneliness, a feeling of feeling like a spare part and all sorts of just kind of outside of sex. But they really described those things. And for them, it was a real shock because, they hadn't really prepared themselves for it. And I keep seeing and understanding how that experience occurs. Okay. I keep rubbing my hands for some reason. I think it's like I'm some sort of school teacher. This has been fantastic. I have all these pages of notes of things that I've learned and these wonderful topics around sex. And I love talking about sex. I think it's probably one of the areas of life that we could talk about that can have the most profound and important impact, not just on ourselves, but on the world in general. I think it'd go a long way if we all became just 20% more comfortable talking about sex. So I'm super, super grateful to you, Kate, for today. I imagine the listeners are like, because you mentioned the book, you mentioned the podcast. I know you are also very active in putting out content and also speaking in different places. And also, so where can the listeners hear more from you, read what you've been writing and see you?
I would say I'm very sporadic at putting out content, but my book is called The Science of Sex. I always aim to be better. My book is called The Science of Sex, Every Question About Your Sex Life Answered, and that is a kind of over 100 of the most asked questions about sex from a biopsychosocial understanding. So they have everything from anatomy and anatomy diagrams to the psychology of sex, the social parts, and really it's the kind of holistic sex education that so many of us don't feel that we got, that we can hopefully get now. And it's got some amazing illustrations by an incredibly talented illustrator. My podcast is the Sexual Wellness Sessions. So we have, we're on season 4, and every episode is a deep dive into a particular topic. So, for example, Cam Fraser came on and spoke about masculinity and sex lives. We've got an episode about erectile dysfunction, desire, postnatal sex lives, trauma, chemsex, motherhood. I mean, the list goes kind of on and on and on. Stress lives and sex. But some of the guests and the experts are amazing. They are either experts in their field or people who have had those experiences themselves and have kind of gone on to do something with those experiences. And I'm on Instagram at Kate Moyle Therapy, and my website is katemoyle.co.uk.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. So listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode, tell a friend, share it with somebody, because I'm sure there's someone in your life that could do with listening to this conversation. And maybe some of you, it's your partner. And as Kate wonderfully explained earlier, how you can do that, how you can talk about, use this podcast as a beautiful bridge and opening and doorway to having a conversation about sex, or, bringing something new into your sex life as well. So all there is to say is a big thank you to Kate. Thank you for your wisdom and your knowledge and your energy. And it's always such a pleasure to talk and be in your presence. So I'm super grateful for you to be here today.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
And listeners, thank you. And until next week, I say ciao, ciao. I want to say a big thank you for listening. It's people like yourself that really help get the podcast out into the world. Especially if you're often sharing the episodes and the podcast with people that you feel just could do with listening, right? Can see a different way of being a man, maybe a different way of having dating lives and intimacy and relationships. So I want to say a big thank you. And if maybe after listening to this episode, you think, oh, there's someone actually you could really do with this, please share it with them. Share the love. I'm really, really grateful. And if, you want to get in contact with me for any questions, or you want to talk about coaching or any working together, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at theauthenticman_, or you can email me hello@theauthenticman.net. Thank you very much.